The night was thick with silence as Mark drove through the winding roads of the dense woods, his headlights slicing through the oppressive darkness. Each turn brought shadows that seemed to whisper secrets, the trees looming like silent sentinels. He leaned back in his seat, fighting off fatigue, his eyelids growing heavier with each passing mile. The hum of the engine was soothing, but a creeping unease settled in the pit of his stomach. His mind wandered to home, the warmth of his living room, the soft glow of his bedside lamp, comforts that felt worlds away. The gas station appeared as a beacon in the dark, its flickering neon signs struggling to stay lit. It felt out of place, like an oasis in a desolate desert. Mark parked his car and stepped out, the cold air biting at his skin. The only sound was the crunch of gravel beneath his feet, a stark contrast to the heavy stillness that enveloped him. He shivered, glancing around as if the woods were watching him, their branches swaying gently, almost tauntingly. As he approached the pumps, Mark felt a strange sense of foreboding wash over him. The gas station had an old, decrepit charm, with cracked windows and faded signage. The only attendant, a gaunt figure named Eddie, leaned against the wall, his face half hidden in shadow. His eyes glinted with an unsettling intensity, as if he were studying Mark rather than simply greeting him. "Evening," Eddie said, his voice low and gravelly, almost lost in the stillness. There was something in his tone, a hint of disinterest, that sent a chill down Mark's spine. Mark nodded, forcing a smile, and turned to the pump. He filled his tank, glancing at the broken-down convenience store beside him. The fluorescent lights buzzed ominously, casting a sickly glow over the rows of empty shelves. He felt a fleeting urge to check for snacks but dismissed it, focusing instead on the task at hand. As he stood by the pump, he noticed the surrounding woods seemed to close in, the trees swaying like specters in the dark. After a few minutes, the pump sputtered and died. Mark frowned, jiggling the nozzle. Nothing happened. He glanced at the digital display. His heart sank as the needle on the fuel gauge remained stubbornly unmoved. Panic surged through him. "What the hell?" he muttered under his breath. He climbed back into his car, turning the ignition with a desperate hope. The engine coughed and wheezed, but ultimately fell silent. Frustration boiled over into dread. He was trapped, miles away from home, with no one to help him in the vast, echoing night. The weight of isolation pressed heavily on his chest as he stepped out again, the chill of the night seeping into his bones. As he looked around, the shadows seemed to shift, twisting in ways that felt almost sentient. He could sense the emptiness of the woods closing in on him, and for a moment he thought he heard a distant rustle, as if something was moving just beyond the tree line. Mark shook his head, trying to shake off the growing unease. He was alone, stranded in the wilderness, and the night was just beginning. With no other options, Mark's instincts kicked in. He hurriedly made his way to the convenience store, its door creaking open as if reluctant to let him in. The interior was dimly lit, casting long shadows that danced along the walls. The air was stale, thick with the scent of old snacks and something metallic he couldn't quite place. Inside, the store felt claustrophobic, as if the walls were closing in. Mark took a moment to collect himself, glancing at the shelves filled with dusty products. Most items had expiration dates long past, and the few fresh items looked unappetizing. A television in the corner, its screen flickering with static, added to the unsettling ambiance. As he wandered the aisles, the flickering fluorescent lights overhead began to pulse erratically, casting an eerie glow that made the shadows stretch and twist unnaturally. A chill raced down his spine. Mark tried to shake off the feeling, but his unease grew as he sensed a presence just beyond his line of sight. He could almost hear whispers, too soft to decipher, but their cadence sent shivers crawling up his back. When he reached for a bottle of water, he noticed the label was torn and faded, and the water inside appeared murky. He hesitated, feeling an inexplicable sense of dread, and put it back. Just then, a loud crash from the back room shattered the silence. His heart raced as he turned toward the sound, adrenaline surging. Compelled by a mix of fear and curiosity, Mark crept toward the cracked door leading to the storeroom. He peered inside but found nothing but darkness. The air felt thick and charged, as if it were alive. An inexplicable urge told him to turn back, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting just beyond the threshold. Suddenly, the TV flickered to life, the static morphing into a fleeting image. a grotesque face that seemed to leer at him for just a moment before vanishing into the static once again. Mark staggered back, gasping, his mind racing with panic. The unsettling feeling of being watched intensified, as if unseen eyes were scrutinizing his every move. "Hey, you all right?" a voice asked, snapping him back to reality. A woman stood in front of him, her hollow eyes glinting in the low light. Her face was gaunt, with shadows etched deep around her features. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice barely above a murmur, sending a chill down his spine. "The woods don't like strangers at night." Mark felt his stomach drop. "What do you mean?" he stammered, desperately searching for answers in her vacant gaze. "The night hides things. Things that don't belong," she continued, her eyes darting nervously toward the door. "You must leave before they find you." Her warning echoed ominously in his mind, but before he could respond, she vanished as quickly as she appeared, leaving him alone in the dimly lit store, feeling even more isolated. The overhead lights flickered again, plunging him into darkness momentarily. When they flickered back to life, he found himself alone, the woman gone, replaced by the oppressive silence. He shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts, but the fear gnawed at him, intensifying with every passing second. The whispers grew louder, the air thickening with an unnameable dread. Mark turned his attention to the door, wanting nothing more than to escape this suffocating place. He pushed against the heavy door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic clawed at his throat as he pulled harder, but it was as if the store itself was holding him captive. Desperation clawed at his mind as he backed away, searching for another exit. That's when he noticed movement in the shadows, dark figures flickering in and out of sight, always just out of reach, always watching. The line between reality and fear began to blur, and Mark felt himself slipping deeper into a nightmarish spiral, trapped in a store that seemed to breathe with the darkness outside. Mark stood frozen in the middle of the convenience store, his heart pounding as the shadows seemed to shift and pulse around him. His breath came in ragged gasps, each exhale turning the air colder, as though the store was breathing with him, matching his fear. He took a step back, his body trembling, and the whispers grew louder, filling the space with dissonant murmurs that twisted his thoughts. It felt like the walls were closing in, squeezing the air from his lungs. As he stumbled through the store, his flashlight flickered weakly, illuminating fleeting glimpses of what lurked in the shadows. Shapes that slithered and writhed at the edges of his vision. Were they human? Were they even real? Every time he tried to focus, they melted back into the darkness, leaving only the oppressive sense of being hunted. He rushed to the front door, yanking at the handle with all his strength. It was as if the door had fused with the frame, refusing to let him out. His mind raced, the panic in his chest clawing at his sanity. He turned and screamed, "Eddie, help me!" But Eddie was nowhere to be seen, the gas station eerily silent except for the growing murmur of voices echoing from unseen corners. Suddenly, from the depths of the store, Eddie emerged. His face was half lit by the flickering lights, twisted into a grin that didn't reach his dead, hollow eyes. His presence was wrong, like he didn't belong in this world anymore. Mark's voice cracked as he stammered, "What's going on? Let me out of here." Eddie's grin widened unnaturally, stretching his skin taut. "You're not the first, and you won't be the last," he said, his voice a chilling whisper that seemed to come from all around. "This place, it takes what almost all men wants, and tonight it wants you." Mark's blood ran cold. The weight of the words sank deep into him as he realized he wasn't dealing with just a man or a gas station. There was something far darker at play, something ancient, malevolent, and unstoppable. The lights flickered again, plunging the store into almost complete darkness. Mark's flashlight flickered once, twice, then went out, leaving him standing in the suffocating blackness. The whispers turned into voices now, more distinct, yet still indistinguishable. A chorus of lost souls trapped like him. From the corners of his vision, the shadows began to take shape. Their forms no longer just vague silhouettes, but grotesque figures twisted in unnatural ways. Their faces were hollow, like Eddie's, and their movements were jerky, as if they had forgotten how to be human. They moved closer, closing in on him from every side, their whispers becoming an eerie chant. Mark backed away, his legs shaking, but there was nowhere to run. His back hit the wall, and he felt the cold, damp surface press against him as the figures loomed closer. He tried to scream, but his voice failed him, choked by the terror that had seized him. Desperation gave him one last burst of strength. His mind screamed at him to run, and he bolted toward the back of the store where he'd seen the emergency exit. His feet pounded against the floor as he raced through the aisles, but the shadows moved faster, twisting and writhing in his path, reaching for him with skeletal hands that clawed at the air. He slammed into the back door, shaking it violently. It wouldn't open at first, as if mocking his efforts. His pulse thundered in his ears, the shadows now right behind him, their cold breath on the back of his neck. Just as one of them grazed his arm with icy fingers, he felt the door give way. It burst open and he tumbled outside into the biting night air. The woods were darker than before, the trees looming like silent giants, their branches reaching towards him as if to pull him back into the gas station's grasp. Mark didn't stop. He ran, blindly tearing through the underbrush, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The voices behind him grew distant, but he could still feel them, could still sense the station's malevolent pull trying to drag him back. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mark stumbled onto a road. He collapsed onto the pavement, gasping for air, just as headlights appeared in the distance. A car screeched to a halt, and a concerned driver rushed out, asking if he was okay. Mark couldn't speak, his body trembling, his mind still trapped in the horrors he had just escaped. He glanced back toward where the gas station should have been, but there was nothing. Only the darkness of the woods and the distant echo of whispers on the wind. The gas station had vanished, leaving no trace of the nightmare it had trapped him in. As he climbed into the driver's car, exhausted and broken, he glanced into the rearview mirror one last time. For a split second, he thought he saw Eddie's face staring back at him from the back seat, grinning that same twisted smile. Mark's heart skipped a beat, but when he blinked, it was gone, leaving him unsure if the nightmare had truly ended, or if it had just begun. Story 2. The abandoned mining town loomed in the distance, its skeletal structures silhouetted against a dimming sky. Rusting machinery lay strewn about like forgotten relics of a tragic past, and the air was thick with a heavy silence, punctuated only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant cry of a bird. Jack parked his truck at the mouth of the mine, his heart racing with a mix of excitement and trepidation. This was not just another survey, it was a journey into the unknown, a pilgrimage to a place where the echoes of the past whispered secrets. Jack, in his late 30s, had rugged features, a testament to years spent in the field. His keen eyes, however, betrayed a hint of weariness. Memories of his brother haunted him, their last conversation replaying in his mind like an old record stuck on repeat. He had promised to keep his brother safe, a promise shattered when his sibling had vanished in a mine just like this one. The thought weighed heavily on him as he donned his helmet and switched on his flashlight, its beam slicing through the darkness like a knife. As Jack stepped inside, the temperature dropped sharply, sending a shiver down his spine. The beam of his flashlight danced over the jagged walls, revealing remnants of the mining operation. Rusty rails, crumbling supports, and faded warning signs. He pulled out the old map he had discovered, the lines tracing a path into the depths of the mine, marked with cryptic notations. Ignoring the locals' warnings of strange occurrences, he felt an inexplicable pull toward the unexplored depths. With every step he took deeper into the mine, a sense of unease washed over him. The air felt heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. The deeper he went, the more the walls seemed to close in around him, like the mine itself was alive, breathing and pulsating with an ancient malevolence. Faint echoes of his footsteps morphed into whispers, indistinguishable yet familiar, tickling the edges of his consciousness. Suddenly, a gust of wind whipped through the tunnel, sending a chill racing up his spine. Jack halted, his breath hitching in his throat. Just the wind, he muttered to himself, yet the sound felt too deliberate, as if someone was watching him. He glanced around, the shadows stretching and shifting as he moved. Just outside the reach of his flashlight, he thought he caught a glimpse of a figure darting away, a trick of the light or his imagination. As he continued down the narrow corridor, he discovered remnants of miners' belongings, A rusted lunchbox, a tattered jacket hanging limply from a nail, and a dusty helmet left abandoned on the ground. Each item whispered stories of lives once lived, dreams shattered in an instant. Jack's heart raced, not just from fear, but from a growing sense of dread. Something about this place felt wrong, as if the very walls were saturated with sorrow. Driven by a mix of dread and curiosity, Jack pressed on, feeling compelled to uncover the secrets hidden within the mine. But as he moved deeper, a sudden noise, a distant, echoing crash, startled him. He turned sharply, heart pounding, and suddenly the ground beneath him gave way. With a bone-jarring thud, Jack fell into a narrow shaft, the world spinning around him. Darkness enveloped him, and his flashlight flickered ominously before extinguishing completely. He lay still for a moment, disoriented and terrified, the silence pressing in like a weight on his chest. Panic surged as he realized he was trapped, the oppressive darkness thickening around him. In that suffocating silence, the whispers returned, clearer now, echoing off the cold stone walls. Jack strained to listen, his heart racing. Were they calling for help or warning him to turn back? As he fumbled in the dark for a way to pull himself free, the temperature dropped further, a cold breath against his neck, sending chills down his spine. It was then that he truly understood. He was not alone in the mine. Jack's heart raced as he lay trapped in the suffocating darkness. The air was damp and stagnant, clinging to his skin like a cold shroud. He struggled to control his breathing, each shallow gasp echoing in the silence, punctuated only by the unsettling whispers that seemed to dance around him. The whispers morphed into distinct phrases, tugging at his memory, and he strained to recognize their voices. Were they real or merely the product of his growing fear? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jack gathered his strength and began to crawl, feeling his way along the rough, uneven stone of the shaft. Panic clawed at him, the darkness pressing in on all sides. He squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, summoning the courage to push through the fear. "I can get out of this," he muttered, but the words felt hollow in the suffocating blackness. As he inched forward, the whispers intensified, growing louder and more insistent. Jack stumbled into a small chamber, its walls covered in strange markings that seemed to writhe in the flickering light of his dying flashlight. The symbols glowed faintly, pulsating with an energy that was both ancient and unnerving. The shadows around him flickered and danced, and for a brief moment, Jack could swear he saw figures moving in the periphery, pale, gaunt silhouettes lingering just out of sight. His heart raced as he recalled the stories he had heard in town, tales of miners trapped in the dark, their spirits forever wandering in search of escape. The thought of their lost souls sent a jolt of terror through him. A sudden gust of wind swept through the chamber, extinguishing his flashlight completely, plunging him into pitch darkness. Jack's breath quickened as he fumbled for his backup flashlight, but the familiar comfort of light was nowhere to be found. The whispers turned into wails, a cacophony of sorrow echoing off the walls, drowning out his thoughts. It was as if the very spirits of the mine had awakened, angry and seeking retribution. With the darkness closing in, Jack's fear turned to desperation. He shouted into the void, demanding to know what they wanted, but only silence answered. Then out of the stillness, a voice broke through, a low, mournful whisper that sent chills down his spine. "Help us," it pleaded, a tone both familiar and foreign. Suddenly, a figure materialized before him, illuminated by an eerie glow that seemed to emanate from the very walls. It was a spectral version of his brother, the same face that haunted Jack's dreams. "You abandoned me," the ghost hissed, a mixture of sorrow and anger lacing his words. "You let me die." Jack stumbled backward, shaking his head in disbelief. "No, I searched for you," he cried, tears streaming down his cheeks. The apparition loomed closer, its hollow eyes piercing into Jack's soul, revealing the deep pain and betrayal that had festered since that fateful day. The mine's dark history unfurled in Jack's mind, flashes of panic, screams, and a cave-in that had trapped his brother and others, their cries for help swallowed by the unforgiving earth. As the realization struck him, Jack felt a surge of guilt wash over him. He had turned his back on his brother's memory, consumed by the desire to forget. But now, trapped in the very darkness that had claimed his life, he was forced to confront the truth. Desperation clawed at him, and Jack fell to his knees, pleading for forgiveness. "I'm sorry, I never stopped looking for you." The spectral figure's expression softened for a moment, and Jack felt an echo of warmth amidst the cold, a flicker of hope. But just as quickly, the darkness swallowed the light, and the whispers returned, angry, vengeful, a chorus of lost souls demanding justice. Shadows surged toward him, enveloping him in a suffocating embrace. Jack felt a chill seep into his bones as the past crashed into the present, dragging him further into the mind's abyss. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he struggled to free himself from the suffocating darkness. The whispers morphed into a symphony of anguish, a relentless tide of voices that swirled around him, echoing the pain of the miners who had perished in the depths of the earth. He was trapped, not just in the mine, but within the weight of his guilt and unresolved grief. With every ounce of courage, Jack rose to his feet, his resolve hardening. "I won't abandon you again," he shouted into the shadows, his voice cracking with emotion. "I will help you find peace." The words felt foreign but necessary, a lifeline thrown into the abyss of despair that surrounded him. He felt the air shift, a pause in the anguished chorus, as if the spirits were contemplating his declaration. The atmosphere grew heavy, and the darkness began to shift, revealing glimpses of the past. Jack saw fleeting images, miners at work, laughter echoing down the tunnels, and then the catastrophic collapse that sealed their fates. He watched helplessly as his brother's ghost emerged from the shadows, his face etched with sorrow. "You can't help them," he whispered, his voice tinged with despair. "They want revenge, not salvation." But something shifted within Jack. He could feel the spirit's pain, their desire for acknowledgement and remembrance, not vengeance. "No," he declared, tears streaming down his cheeks. "You deserve to be remembered. You deserve justice, not revenge." The shadows recoiled and the whispers turned into a cacophony of cries, a whirlwind of emotion that surrounded him. In that moment of vulnerability, Jack opened his heart, pouring out his sorrow, regret, and the love he still felt for his brother. "I should have fought harder to find you," he admitted, his voice cracking. "I'm so sorry for leaving you behind." The air thickened with energy, the shadows swirling around him like a storm. The spirits hesitated, their anguish palpable, and the echoes of the past began to fade into a haunting melody of forgiveness. As Jack faced his brother's ghost, he took a step closer, extending a trembling hand. "I won't let you be forgotten. I will tell your story and honor your memory." The ghost's expression shifted, a flicker of recognition illuminating his hollow eyes. Jack felt a warmth enveloping him as the spectral figure reached out, their hands almost touching. "Find us," the spirit whispered, the anger dissipating into sorrow. "Remember us." Suddenly, the ground beneath Jack shook violently, and the mine groaned in response to the emotional turmoil. Dust and debris fell from the ceiling, and he felt a surge of panic. He turned to flee, the mine coming alive around him, but a new energy guided him forward. The shadows that had once threatened to consume him now seemed to part, revealing a path lit by a faint glow. He sprinted through the twisting tunnels, guided by an instinct that felt both foreign and familiar. The whispers had transformed into a gentle hum, urging him onward. Jack burst into the small chamber where he had first seen the ghost of his brother. The glowing symbols on the walls pulsed with a rhythmic light, illuminating a narrow passageway that had been hidden from view. With renewed hope, Jack raced through the passage, feeling the air shift from oppressive to freeing. As he emerged from the mine's mouth, the night sky stretched before him, stars twinkling like distant memories. He collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, the weight of the darkness lifting from his shoulders. Behind him, the whispers faded into a serene silence. As Jack looked back at the mine, he felt a sense of closure. The spirits of the miners, including his brother, had finally found peace. They were no longer trapped in the darkness, their stories woven into the fabric of the land. In the weeks that followed, Jack dedicated himself to preserving the memory of the miners. He reached out to historians, collected their stories, and shared the tales of their lives and sacrifices. The mine, once a symbol of tragedy, transformed into a place of remembrance, honoring those who had been lost. But as he lay in bed at night, the echoes of the whispers still lingered in his mind, a haunting reminder that while he had helped the spirits find peace, the shadows of the past would always remain. He had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, yet a part of him would forever be entwined with the echoes of the mine. And in the quiet moments, when the world fell silent, he could still hear the faint whispers of his brother, urging him to remember, to keep their story alive. Story 3. The office had an unsettling stillness that the man couldn't quite place. It was his first day, and he should have felt excited, maybe a bit anxious, but this was different. The silence wasn't the calming type. It clung to the air like a heavy fog, making every sound seem louder, more pronounced. The dim, almost sickly glow of the old fluorescent lights didn't help. They flickered every few seconds, as if struggling to stay alive. Occasionally they would buzz, sending shivers down his spine. He wandered the corridors of the building, trying to familiarize himself with his new workplace. Most of the other employees had gone home, leaving him alone, save for the faint echo of his own footsteps on the linoleum floors. As he passed by various cubicles and conference rooms, something caught his eye. A faint flicker of light coming from a hallway he hadn't explored yet. He hesitated for a moment, telling himself it was probably just an electrical issue, but his curiosity got the better of him. He made his way down the dimly lit corridor, which seemed longer than it should have been. The walls were lined with dusty picture frames that displayed faded photographs of previous employees, their faces blurred and unrecognizable from years of neglect. At the end of the hallway, there was a single door, its wooden surface worn and scratched, the paint peeling at the edges. The nameplate next to it was defaced, as if someone had violently scratched off the name with something sharp. A cold draft seeped from underneath the door, causing the hairs on the back of his neck to stand up. Against his better judgment, he reached for the doorknob. The metal felt colder than it should, and as he turned it, the door creaked open, revealing a small, windowless office. The air inside was thick with dust, and the furniture looked as though it hadn't been touched in years. A single dim desk lamp flickered on the corner of the desk, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. Just as he stepped inside, his phone buzzed in his pocket, startling him. He pulled it out. An unknown number was calling. His thumb hovered over the decline button, but something made him answer. The line connected to what connected, and for a few seconds there was nothing but silence. Then he heard it, a faint rhythmic sound, like breathing, slow and deliberate. It wasn't his own. His breath hitched in his throat as the static on the other end of the call grew louder, almost deafening. He hung up immediately, his heart racing. As he turned to leave, the door, which had been wide open, slowly creaked shut on its own. The unsettling call still lingered in his mind as he returned to his desk, trying to shake off the creeping unease. He sat down and stared at his computer screen, its glow the only source of comfort in the dim office. The silence pressed in again, thicker this time, like a living thing watching him from the corners of the room. He attempted to distract himself by working, but his hands trembled as they hovered over the keyboard. As he typed, the soft click-clack of the keys felt strangely loud in the otherwise silent room. A few minutes passed, and just as he began to get lost in his work, he heard it, another sound. Faint at first, barely audible, but unmistakable, the sound of typing. His fingers froze. He lifted his head, staring at the empty cubicles ahead of him. The tapping continued, rhythmic and steady, coming from the direction of the abandoned desks a few rows away. His breath caught in his throat. There was no one else in the office. He had seen everyone leave earlier. Slowly, cautiously, he stood up and walked toward the sound. The typing grew louder as he approached, like invisible hands were hammering on the keys. It came from a cubicle at the far end of the room, one he hadn't noticed before. His footsteps were slow and deliberate, the distance to the source of the sound feeling longer than it should have. When he finally reached the cubicle, the noise abruptly stopped. He peered over the edge. The desk was covered in a thick layer of dust, and the computer looked ancient, like it hadn't been touched in years. The screen was black, the keyboard untouched. Confused and growing more uneasy, he slowly backed away, heart pounding in his chest. He made his way back to his desk, trying to convince himself that it had been his imagination. But when he sat down again, his computer screen had changed. His heart skipped a beat. The document he had been working on was gone, replaced by a single line of text. "I see you." His stomach dropped, and his mouth went dry. He stared at the words, feeling a cold sweat break out across his skin. He hadn't typed that. His fingers trembled as he reached for the keyboard, but before he could touch it, the fluorescent lights above began to flicker wildly, casting strange, distorted shadows across the room. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, moving and twisting on the walls like they had lives of their own. They formed shapes, almost humanoid figures, creeping toward him. The light buzzed louder, filling the air with an electric hum as if the building itself was coming alive. He leaped from his chair, his pulse racing, and backed away from the desk. His eyes darted around the office, searching for any sign of movement. The lights continued to flicker, throwing the room into moments of total darkness, followed by bursts of blinding light. The shadows continued to move, distorting, crawling closer. The room was now a nightmare of flickering lights and dancing shadows. His pulse thundered in his ears as he backed away from his desk, heart pounding like a drum in the suffocating silence that followed each flicker. He needed to leave. The air felt too thick, too cold, as if something unseen was breathing down his neck, watching his every move. He spun around, making a break for the exit. The door wasn't far, just across the open office space, but every step felt heavier, like wading through quicksand. The hum of the lights was now a persistent drone, vibrating through the floor beneath his feet. When he reached the door, his trembling hand reached for the handle. It wouldn't budge. His eyes widened in panic as he yanked harder, desperately trying to force it open. But it stayed stubbornly locked, as if something or someone was holding it shut from the other side. His breath came out in ragged gasps. He glanced behind him, only to see the shadows moving again, slithering across the walls like dark tendrils. They shifted and warped, twisting into unnatural shapes. Then the sound of footsteps. They were faint at first, soft, like someone walking barefoot on the cold tile floors. But with each step, they grew louder, heavier. The thud of shoes echoed down the hallway behind him, approaching at an unnervingly slow pace. Whoever or whatever was coming, it wasn't in a hurry. His heart raced as the sound drew nearer, the steady rhythm of footfalls creating a terrible mounting tension. He backed away from the door, eyes darting between the darkened corners of the office and the hallway. The footsteps stopped just around the corner. For a moment, there was nothing but the agonizing silence. Then, with deliberate slowness, a figure emerged. It was a woman. She stood in the doorway of the same distant hallway where he had first seen the flickering light. Her appearance was faded, like an old photograph coming into focus after years of neglect. She wore an outdated office uniform, the kind that hadn't been in style for decades. Her face was shrouded in shadow, but her eyes, those eyes, glowed faintly in the dim light. They were cold and hollow, empty of life. She didn't move, just stood there watching him, the flicker of the dying lights making her seem like a static image frozen in time. He tried to speak, but no words came out. His mouth was dry, his throat tight with fear. As his mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, she took a single, slow step forward. Her shoes made no sound this time, as though she was floating just above the floor. A low whisper filled the room, barely audible, like a voice carried on the wind. He couldn't understand the words, but the sound sent a chill down his spine. She took another step, her face still obscured, but those lifeless eyes locked onto him. The shadows behind her seemed to ripple, stretching unnaturally long as if drawn toward her. With each step she took, the air grew colder. His breath came out in visible puffs, frosting in the suddenly freezing room. He stumbled backward, his body rigid with terror, but he couldn't tear his gaze away from her. Then, without warning, the lights went out completely. For a moment, there was nothing but pitch-black darkness. His heart pounded in the suffocating void, and he fumbled for his phone to use the light, but his fingers were clumsy, shaking too much to function. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on, dim and sputtering. The woman was gone. The office was eerily still, as if nothing had ever happened. But then he noticed something on his desk, a small old ID badge. The plastic was yellowed with age, and the name printed on it was his. But when he looked closer, his blood ran cold. The photo wasn't him. It was her. The phone on his desk rang, the same unknown number. His hand hovered over the receiver, but this time he didn't dare answer.